G'day everyone, Kate from the Narrate team here. In the third part of Narrate's series, Merge, Josh looks at how obedience is defined in the Bible and discusses ways to manage yourself in the consequences of decisions.
Morning. How are ya? Good. So, I'm so used to doing the host or gather, scatter thing that I'm really tempted to just start things off this morning with. So in a couple of minutes, our ushers are going to come forward, or you're going to be here for about 60 minutes, but I'll hold off. For those of you who are guests with us, that is an inside joke, so sorry. But welcome to Narrate. We understand that coming into a building in which you might not know many, if any, people at all isn't necessarily an easy thing to do. And so thanks. It's an honor to have you with us. If you haven't been here the past few weeks, we've been having this conversation called Merge. And what we mean by merge is balancing our willfulness, our work ethic, our drive to achieve dreams and hopes and so on with our being surrendered to circumstances that are outside of our control, whether that be people, because we can't control people, or perhaps even what God has planned for our lives, which is different than what we had intended. And it's not a clashing of those things. It's not clashing of willingness and being surrendered. It's a coming together of those, because it's honoring to us and others and God to work hard, but it's also honoring to be surrendered to things that might happen. So it's the coming together, hence the term merge. And Adam, our lead pastor, he started that conversation off a couple of weeks ago by giving a talk called Engaged and Disconnected. And what he meant by that is, what if we were engaged in the battle, invested everything that we can control into our efforts, into our job, into that relationship, and then we disconnected ourselves from the outcomes that are outside of our control. We understood that there's some things that we can't manipulate, and so we invest who we are and what we can, and then we step back and let the outcome play itself out. What if that is helpful to us becoming healthier, more peaceful people? And then last week, Adam talked about literally the value of a breath, and asked the question, what if we were less reactive, even just 10% of the time to circumstances? How could that be helpful to our lives? How could that help us be healthy? And how could that be helpful to those whom we do life with? Today, we're going to continue the merge conversation, particularly in terms of obedience, as it pertains to God especially. And quite frankly, I feel like I'm way above my pay grade, but we're going to give it a try and define really what does obedience seem to mean in the text, and then how are ways that we can be obedient, and how can that be helpful to our lives. In managing ourselves, it allows for our lives, it diminishes the opportunity for things to become unmanageable. But we also are going to make mistakes. We're humans, right? And so how can we treat ourselves with grace in those moments so that it doesn't become worse and worse? And I want to start off by sharing a personal story that is frankly, it's crude, but I was 9 years old, so hopefully you guys can show me a little bit of grace. 9 or 10 in there, just a little turd. And anyway, but I need to give you some context first. So when I was a kid, my family, we went to church all the time, and our church had church all the time. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, men's hunters breakfast, women's tea party Bible studies. We were remarkably skilled at holding on to those gender norms. Dudes can like tea too. And I know women who hunt. But anyway, we were at church all the time. And for a 9-year-old, the idea of spending several hours of your week in a mostly quiet room listening to some old dude monologue is not necessarily appealing. But there was one silver lining, and it's something that now as an adult I look back on my childhood and endear. And that was that every Sunday afternoon, oftentimes I could go to a friend's house or have a friend over. It was just a fun part of hanging out with a friend outside of the Monday to Friday school context. And I had one friend named Alex who I spent the majority of my time with during this time period of my life. And I remember one Sunday, like many, I asked my mom if Alex could come over, with puppy dog eyes. Mom, can Alex come over? And Alex is like awkwardly standing behind me, picking his nose. And Mom said, sure. And so we went home and we ate lunch. And then it was a pretty cold and rainy day, so we really couldn't do anything outside. And so my mom said, hey, I'm going to run some errands. Do y'all want to go with me? And we said, yeah, sure, something. And so we went with her. And I don't know why, but I remember that we grabbed like this huge bag of dehydrated apricots. Is it apricot? What do y'all say? I've been raised to say apricot. But anyway, apricots. And we grabbed this bag. It was like 2 pounds. And while we're running errands with Mom, Alex and I just mowed those things. That's a lot of fiber in a little boy's stomach. And so, anyway, it's time to go back to church, and we walk into the auditorium, and music is starting, and, at this point, World War III is going on in my stomach, and I don't want to go to the restroom because the church service has already started, and so I just sit there and sing the songs, and Alex and I were standing next to one another. A few pews ahead were our respective parents, and I'm sorry, but we just started to expel this toxic air. Notice I didn't say the word fart because I didn't want to lose your guys' respect in the first few minutes of this morning. And it's bad. People around us are like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And at this church, we would have a few songs, and then music would continue playing, and people would do like a little meet and greet part, And I remember during that meet and greet, people, I vividly, clearly remember this. People were taking advantage of the opportunity, we've got to get away from this spot. And they were moving. And so at this point, service is over, or music is over, rather. And Alex and I are sitting there, and there's this radius of nothingness around us. And, we should be embarrassed, but we're 9-year-old boys. So we're this is the funniest thing in the history of the universe. I'm whispering to Alex, we're going to be legends. And here comes a pun. My parents caught wind of what was going on. I couldn't help it. Sorry. My parents heard what was going on, and they were upset, and so we got in the car after church, and my dad said some words to me that were dreadful to hear during my childhood. Well, when we get home, you're getting a spanking. And that's not a statement for or against spanking. That's just what happened in my household. It was really just like a pat on the bottom and being told not to do that anymore. But anyway, we get home, and despite the gentleness of it in large part, I am terrified, and I'm thinking to myself, this is it. This is the end of my life. These next 8 minutes between church and home, these are the last 8 minutes of my life. And I got to take in these views, and we get home, and, I get reprimanded. And I remember, I don't know why my dad said this, and I asked him if I could share this with you guys, and he laughed and said, sure. But as he was walking out of my room, he stopped in the door jam and looked behind me. And I look at him, eyes clouded with tears, and he says, son, farting's funny, but not in the house of God. I think he was just trying to connect with 9-year-old Josh. But that's an example of my disobedience. There wasn't a rule in the Sonnenberg household, don't fart in church. But there was a rule, don't make a fool of yourself in public and honor your parents and so on. And I suppose I crossed those lines. But that's a form of obedience, right? There's the parent-to-child relationship. That's a form of obedience that we see in the world we live in. There's other forms as well. There's the employer and the employee. There's the teacher and the student. There's the rule of law and citizens who can decide to obey or disobey those laws. And if you don't obey them, there are serious ramifications. There's another form for Christ followers, and that's being obedient to God. And it's really unfortunate because it seems so often in our larger, wider culture that obedience to God is framed negatively, as if God is someone who just doesn't want you to live a full life, doesn't want you to live a happy, joyous life, but makes an arbitrary to-do list, an arbitrary yes and no list. And I don't know necessarily why this is, but I can think of a couple of reasons. For one, it seems like lots of people communicate God as if he is some distant, not with us, but a distant, arbitrary, celestial dictator that decides what he likes and dislikes, and then he imposes that agenda on you. Another phenomenon that we see in our culture there are political leaders on both sides of the ticket that imply with their words that if God were a public policymaker, he would be for this and against this, even though that might or might not be true. And again, the big tragedy in that is it communicates this God who has this arbitrarily made do and don't list. This is so remarkably different than the Jesus that we see in the text that says, no, I have come to give you freedom from this ritualism that has been oppressing you for so long. I've come to give you freedom from these do's and don'ts. I've come to give you life and to give it to you abundantly. I was talking to a friend of mine who I've had since high school. We've been close, high school, college, post-college, and so on. And he claims to be an atheist. He's very vocal and transparent about that with me. And he knows what I'm about, and so we've had some very interesting conversations. And I love how candid and transparent he is, because when I ask him, well, why can't you believe in Jesus? Why does the idea of being a Christ follower, why is that not compelling to you? And he said to me, it's not that I can't intellectually buy it. That's not the thing. I can't be convinced either way whether God does or doesn't exist. But quite frankly, it seems like God doesn't want me to live a full life, and because of that, I'm out. What if this isn't true? What if this God is right here with us this past Christmas season? One part of the Christmas story that just kind of kept hitting me through the month of December is Emmanuel, God with us. And what if this God has this deep care for you, that it's not some yes and no arbitrarily made list, but the reasoning behind obedience is because he knows that in that you will find peace, life, hope, and grace. So, what is obedience? The question we have to ask is what is it? There's several parts of the text that seem to reveal very clearly what obedience is. One of those is in Matthew 22. Jesus interacts with some of the religious leaders of his time, people that were experts, knew the do and don't list extremely well. And he summarizes what it means to be obedient to God profoundly in just a few words. In Matthew 22, it says this: hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law, in the do and don't list? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, these two phrases. One of the first Christian leaders, his name was Paul. He wrote in Romans 13, verse 10, if I can find it here. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. This past fall, we had this conversation called Simple But Demanding. And one of the main texts from the Bible that we drew from during that series was the book of Galatians, also written by this Christian leader named Paul. And he's addressing a group of people that had their lives transformed by Jesus, but then for some reason were reverting their religiosity and their spirituality back to this do and don't list. And he says at one point very poignantly, he says in Galatians 5 verse 6, the only thing that counts You guys are so concerned with all of these do's and don'ts. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. What if this is obedience? To respect and care and be caring toward God, and then also caring toward people. If that's what obedience and disobedience, or if that's what obedience is, then what is disobedience? What does it mean to not love? Have you ever known someone who wrestled with anger? Either that means that they had moments where they just blew up, or they were continually on edge and irritable, and so that the people that live life with them are perpetually walking on eggshells. What is the effect of that anger, the effect of that lack of love? Broken relationships, right? Hurt relationships, loneliness. Have you known someone who, like a parent that tries to control their kids and vicariously live their lives through their kids? What so often happens in that situation is it hurts that relationship. The kid ends up being hurt, and the parent is ultimately hurt as well. Have you known an addict who, instead of looking for fulfillment in loving God and loving people, looks for fulfillment in some other way, whether that be some kind of substance or some kind of practice, what have you? And then the result is they find themselves entrenched in this addiction, and it has a white knuckle grip on them, and their relationships have been damaged because of that addiction. It seems like to be obedient, i.e. to love, is extremely helpful, not only for the people whom you live life with, but also for you. So whenever this God asks that people be obedient, I've been reading the book of Hebrews for the past few weeks, and it deals so much with obedience. Whenever I've read that, I've tried to tell myself that it seems like this God, he cares for my well-being. And so whenever he says, obey me, it's for my hope, it's for my peace, it's for my joy. Now, that leaves me with the question, how you doing? Before moving here, I lived in Bozeman, and I was continuing my education at MSU. And during that time, I worked part-time at a church called Journey Church, a great community. It's closely in relationship with Narrate. In fact, it played a huge role in getting Narrate off the ground several years ago. And I remember after having lived in Bozeman and gone to that church for a while, for several months, that there was the job opening. And so I sent out an email and interacted with the children's pastor. It was a job in the children's ministry. And she said, sure, let's connect. And so we had a few interviews, and things were sparking. It was really going well, really enjoying that. Ended up getting hired on. And after I got hired on, my boss and then the 3 other people in the children's ministry, there was a team of 4 people, we met with a business consultant and took a personality test just to better serve one another. And it was one of those Myers-Briggs. You guys are familiar with that, where it gives you the 4 letters of what you are. And anyway, so we took that. And mine, first off, it said, less than 2% of the population is like you. And I'm like, well, that explains why I don't have any friends. Self-deprecation, the low-hanging fruit of humor. But it also said this, and my boss is reading this description. It's like a bullet point list of what people who are in your category are like. And one of the things that it said was, you do not do well with people telling you what to do. My boss read that. And she just took a breath, and she was like, well, we'll see how it goes. And it went well. We still thoroughly appreciate one another. But, as far as obedience is concerned, obviously I, had a strikeout in that way. But really, how are you doing whenever you think about being obedient to God as defined by these texts that we just read, by loving God and loving others. How are you doing? If you're doing well, you can look back on your life and think to yourself, yeah, I've made a series of decisions that now I am reaping the benefits of that. I've, tried to manage myself well, and so in that, now my life is fairly manageable. If that's you, first off, good job. And then secondly, can we grab a cup of coffee? But maybe you can look back on your life and think, man, I remember when I made those decisions that didn't involve love. How much they damaged my loved ones, hurt my friends, and hurt me. Maybe you can look back and think that in that, the making things right again, the process, the mountain of climbing back to restoring that relationship, restoring that hope and happiness in me was a very long, arduous, difficult process. Maybe some of you are in that position right now. You can look back and say, my goodness, what has happened? These decisions that I made were not helpful. I should have listened to my parents, because if I had, things would be so much better. I should have listened to my parents and friends and not spent time with that group of people or that him or her, but I didn't, and now it's difficult. If that's you, let me rephrase that. For those of us that are in that position, there's a couple of ways you can respond, right? There's one way that doesn't involve grace. And I think that's the way in which we are prone to be. We humans, we have a very difficult time being gracious toward others and also gracious toward ourselves. And the problem is, without grace, so much of life, or without grace, things become full of regret, self-hatred, self-loathing, and then what happens after that is a even continued cycle of disobedience. It doesn't help in any way to lack grace. But then there also is the other approach, which is the polar opposite of that, to have grace toward yourself, to identify, yeah, I made these decisions and they were not helpful and I'm paying the consequences for them now, but with grace and a good bit of help from people and God, it can be better. It might take some time, but it can be better. And that view of God, it has to involve this God that's with us, right? This God that cares for us, that isn't the celestial deity that's distant, way off, floating around in the clouds, making this arbitrary do and don't list, but this God who is like, I want to share this life with you. I will dive into this difficulty, this pain with you, and I will provide you the grace and the hope to get better, to restore that relationship, to climb that Mount Everest of restoration. I read the Sermon on the Mount sometimes, and there's one part of it that has been particularly helpful in developing this morning. And that's in Matthew 7. It's the whole ask, seek, knock part. Ask and you shall receive, knock and the door will be open to you, seek and you shall find. But there's a few parts of it that could be helpful to us this morning. It says this: which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? I love these ancient texts because, we read this and well, that's a pretty weird example. But I imagine 2,000 years ago, people were like, wow, that's super good. Then he continues, if you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? This involves, prayer and interacting with God and so on, but it also involves the component of God comparing himself to a father, and a good one. Of course, there's some bad fathers in the world, but there's also some good ones, right? Have you seen a good father that lacked grace, that lacked understanding? Have you seen a good teacher that lacked grace and understanding? I have a friend who has a few kids, and it's just for him, I love to see the way he expects his kids to make mistakes, but that he doesn't hold that against them, and he provides for them grace and even goes into the process with them and helps them grow to maturity. He's a part of that with them. If these good fathers can do that, as Jesus said, how much more can your Father in heaven help you be gracious toward you? I called my dad a few weeks ago. One thing I love about this community is it seems like the vast majority of you are very intentional about becoming healthier, more peaceful people. And so, I try to do that as well. And especially over the past few months, I've been particularly determined. And I identified a part of my life that it's like, this is not helpful to those whom I share life with. It's also not helpful to me. And I shared that with a couple of friends, but I needed more. And so I decided to talk to my dad about it. And I remember kind of dreading it because it involves some embarrassment and some shame. And I remember writing in my journal for a few days before I made that phone call. I'm about to call my dad. This isn't going to be easy, but, here we go. And then finally one evening I called my dad, who, other than farting in church, has been a very gracious man. And I shared with him, and you know what he said? It's okay. And you know what? I'm going to help you through this. And I promise, Josh, that we'll make it. What if that's an example, good fathers, of what we have in God? And so as we identify the ways in which we don't measure up, as we identify the ways in which we don't love as well as we could, the ways in which we are disobedient, what if we can always trust that we have a gracious Father with us that will help us through it? A long time ago, I was in a wedding party, and it was like we were sophomores in college. I think we were 20 years old. Our friend was getting married. Christians have a thing for getting married when they're 12. I'm totally joking. And anyway, the wedding was in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we all went to college in Springfield, Missouri. And so what we did, we all worked one day and then left in the evening and drove through the night to Cincinnati, did the whole wedding rehearsal. Next day, did the wedding, and then packed up and drove back home through the night back to Springfield. It's just stupid planning. Like, who drives through the night? But anyway, that's what we did. And, it's a car full of 20-year-old guys raging jealous hormones because our friend got married and we didn't. And while we're driving down to Springfield, it was like 1 a.m. I got a phone call from a friend, and whom I cared for, and she started sharing with me some of the pain that she was going through in a relationship that she had. And I don't know what happened, but it's just like a lightning bolt of empathy. After I got off that phone call, I just started profusely sobbing, and this is not, it was super embarrassing. It's a car full of 20-year-old guys. We're supposed to be eating beef jerky and talking about chicks. And here I am crying like a little baby, like, that kind of cry. And I kind of got myself under control. And my friend Brian, who was in the driver's seat, I was in the passenger seat. My friend Brian, who is also a Christ follower and had dealt with a fair amount of difficulty during his adolescence, he asked me what was going on, and I wasn't vulnerable at the moment. I didn't share with him what was going on. And he said, well, man, I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what your loved one is going through. But I do know that there is one part of the Bible that has helped me through a great deal of difficulty. And that's in Romans 5. It says, but where sin increased, grace increased all the more. And I remember in that conversation, Just moments before, I was like uncontrollably sobbing. And after he shared that with me, my heart was flooded with hope, with peace, with an understanding that my friend is going to be okay, that others that are dealing with similar forms of pain will be okay, that I'll be okay. So you, Narrate, as we grow together, gosh, I'm grateful to be a part of this community and share life with so many of you. As we identify the ways in which we've failed, the ways in which we haven't been obedient, the ways in which we haven't loved as well as we could have, and we are experiencing the consequences of that. May we embrace that there is a God who is totally gracious toward us with a powerful grace that increases all the more. This God will dive into the pain with us, and this God will help us through the process of restoration. Let's pray. God, thanks so much for you. Thanks so much for your grace. Thanks for this community of people that work hard to become better people. And of course, that involves identifying ways in which we aren't doing so well. In that process, in that work, may we always trust you and trust that you are for us, that you are with us, and that you have a grace that is going to help us through it. We love you. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.